A well-known crime syndicate, Liam McCaffrey, dies of old age in prison, bringing down his global empire of assassination, robbery, and extortion once and for all. In Buffalo, New York, married couple Dan and Jessica Morgan are excited to celebrate their anniversary, and so Jessica goes to their favorite hotel's bar ahead of her husband, and Dan talks to her on the phone and guides her to their reserved room, while he scales up the walls of the hotel in hopes of surprising her. Jessica reaches the room and is pleasantly surprised to find a beautiful, luxurious necklace waiting for her on the bed. As Jessica appreciates the beauty of her gift, Dan appears behind her and amps the surprise.
What do you think?
As the couple starts appreciating one another for the amazing years of marriage they've shared, their oldest son, Kyle, and their 4-year-old Max ruin their romantic night by forcing them to return home to deal with their sick dog. The couple rush home without complaining, as they value their family more than anything and love helping and having fun with their kids.
You said it! You're unbelievable!
A few weeks later, on Thanksgiving, the Morgans go to Jessica's parents' house and spend a fun day with their extended family. Fun and chaos erupt throughout the day as everyone is in a cheerful mood. And luckily, Dan manages to prevent a couple of potential disasters.
You're unbelievable.
At dinner, the Morgans' oldest daughter, Nina, who is studying journalism in London, joins the family in a video call and catches up with everyone. Nina is delighted to learn that her athlete mother has gotten a job as head of women's track at Ohio State University and encourages her to take it, despite Jessica's fear to ask her husband to move out of the city he loves. Then, before she hangs up, Nina advises Jessica to talk to Dan as soon as possible. A few days later, while Dan excitedly decorates their house for the holidays, he is upset to hear that Nina has decided not to come home for Christmas and urges her to change her mind so that they can have their typical family holiday. Then, Dan reprimands his gamer son Kyle for hacking his school network and deleting all of the students' grades as a prank and warns him to focus on his school. The next day, Dan goes to work at his security advising firm, finds a job offer in London, and takes it, hoping to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and arranging to take his whole family over there so that they can celebrate Christmas with Nina, while he finishes a quick job as a security advisor in a bank. Later, Kyle drives the whole family home, while Dan closely supervises and enthusiastically informs everyone of his Christmas in London idea. Dan works hard to convince his hesitant family of his plan and finally succeeds. However, Kyle gets distracted by this conversation and almost crashes the car.
Well, stop sign! Oh, shit!
A few days later, the family heads to London and becomes enchanted with the holiday vibes. Later that day, instead of waiting for Nina at their hotel, Dan decides to surprise her and takes the family to her apartment. There, Nina is shocked to see everyone, especially since she hasn't had the time to get rid of her boyfriend, Omar.
Whoa! Whoa!
Nina reluctantly introduces Omar to everyone, and everyone seems to take it well except Dan, who is overprotective of his daughter. Later, the Morgans and Omar go out for a walk around the buzzing city, and Omar impresses the boys by showing off his cool parkour skills.
Let's go. You know I'm having too much fun.
Unfortunately, Max decides to copy Omar and falls flat on his face, causing Dan and Jessica to come rushing. Dan is annoyed at this and admonishes Omar, who calmly takes it, and even advises the concerned father not to be too overprotective and shares that that's what ruined his relationship with his father. The next morning, Nina meets her family at the hotel and spends some quality time with her mother and encourages her to tell Dan about the Ohio offer as soon as possible, while Dan goes to his meeting at the bank. Later, Nina takes her brothers out to the park, hoping to give her mother some alone time to build her courage. At the bank, while Dan assesses the security gaps, he is met by a man named Aiden Clark, who asks him to demonstrate the bank's security weakness by breaking into it right there. Dan leads Aiden through the isolated corridors leading to the safe deposit boxes by hacking into a series of security systems.
Just getting warmed up. After you. Shall we?
After you?
No way.
The duo finally reaches the safety deposit boxes, and Dan invites Aiden in before quickly grabbing him in a chokehold, demanding to know who he is, as he had picked up subtle signs that the man has nothing to do with the bank and has an ulterior motive.
Who the hell are you? What's happening here? Doug didn't recognize you.
However, Aiden manages to quickly show Dan a picture of kidnapped Jessica, which forces him to relent. Then, Aiden refers to Dan as Sean McCaffrey, which is his old criminal name, and reveals himself to be his half-brother Finn. He then relates that their father, Liam McCaffrey, had an affair with his maid, but that he had betrayed her after she got pregnant. Finn adds that he has always been jealous of Dan for being adored by Liam and has been holding grudges against his father for abandoning him. Finn then orders Dan to open one of the deposit boxes, which reveals a key to Liam's crime kingdom, before threatening to expose Dan's past with evidence if he ever contacts the police. Then, Finn threatens Dan's family and forces him to take the blame for the current bank robbery so that they can both make it out of the bank. Hence, Dan is forced to pretend to hold Finn hostage as the duo walks out of the bank. Once outside, Finn orders his people to release Jessica, who reunites with her husband, who notices that she has a gun taped to her hand. As the police start arriving, Jessica and Dan flee the area, hoping to hide the gun and get to their kids in time.
No, it's okay, I'm not gonna hurt
It's
you.
okay, don't worry.
I'm so sorry.
I owe you back.
Elsewhere, as Finn drives away with his men, he notices that Dan had stolen the key from him and decides to head to his hotel, predicting that the couple would go there to pick up their kids. Then, Dan calls Nina and tells her to gather her siblings, who are enjoying themselves with Omar at the park, to wait for them there and dispose of their phones. The kids and Omar manage to find Dan and Jessica, and the group starts running away while Dan informs everyone who Finn is.
What? Our uncle?
Not the time, guys.
The group manages to lose Finn and make it to a tour bus, but unfortunately, Finn catches up to them there and holds Dan at gunpoint, demanding the key. Dan manages to tackle Finn, and the two get into an intense fight.
Is it true you spent 20 years selling used cars?
Certified pre-owned.
After a lengthy fight, Jessica joins in and helps Dan by spraying fire retardant on Finn and clouding his vision before directly engaging him in a fight. Seeing this, hoping to rescue Jessica and buy his family some time to figure out their next move, Dan throws the key out of the bus, which forces Finn to get off. Later, when the group finds a moment to breathe, Dan informs everyone that when Finn gets hold of the key, he will have access to Liam's encrypted server, a large sum of money, contacts of assassins, a global surveillance system, and reasons that their best course of action is to leave England as soon as possible. Nina is appalled by this idea and reasons that if she's to consider leaving her life behind, Omar has to join her. Meanwhile, Finn arrives at Liam's mansion in Paris and shows the coveted key to convince the butler Vikram to let him in. Then, Vikram leads Finn to the office where he uses his key to access the encrypted server.
Dad, I'm a man.
The Morgans and Omar reach France and travel to Paris, hidden on the back of a truck. Then, the group goes to Dan's ex-girlfriend, ex-Russian intelligence officer Svetlana's house, to take shelter for a couple of days until they figure out their next move. There, Dan asks Svetlana to get a message to the encrypted server in hopes of meeting with Finn and diplomatically settling their differences. Svetlana agrees to help Dan and prepares dinner for everyone in the meantime. During the meal, she gets to know the family and assumes that Dan has gotten married to develop his cover further. She then forces the kids to eat the food despite their aversion to her cooking. Later that day, Dan manages to arrange a meeting with Finn at a local museum and heads out in hopes of reasoning with his brother and working out their differences. However, Finn details how horrific and lonely his childhood was, disregards Dan's offer to work on their brotherhood, and instead wages war. He then returns to the mansion, contacts multiple assassins, and puts a hit on Dan and offers attractive compensation.
Gets triple their rate.
Before heading to the war, Dan decides to lift the family's spirits and takes them on a boat ride to experience Paris and its Christmas spirit.
S'en fait des manteaux, pourtant quelqu'un m'a dit.
That night, while the family sleeps, Dan looks back on the amazing day he finally had with his family and shares how happy he is with Svetlana, who offers him a drink. As Dan continues to describe how much his family means to him, Svetlana suddenly feels bad and confesses that she has contacted Finn and has tipped him off to their whereabouts in hopes of collecting on the attractive bounty. As Dan tries to process this, she also reveals that she has drugged his drink in hopes of helping the assassins who are on their way catch him. Panicked, Dan tumbles around the house trying to wake everyone and get them out of the house before the assassins arrive, but instead falls over as he can no longer keep himself steady.
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Svetlana then informs everyone of the situation and gives them her old car so that they can make a quick getaway. Kyle and Omar carry Dan as the family heads to the garage and prepares to depart. However, when they get there, they hear some noises from outside and see that the men are already waiting for them at Svetlana's door.
There's a man outside.
While Dan is loaded in the back seat, with the encouragement of Jessica, Kyle drives through the garage door and takes the men by surprise. The hitmen follow the group and gain on their old, slow car. A car chase ensues in the small neighborhood roads of the city and causes destruction. After a lengthy and scary car chase, the family manages to escape.
Oh my god, we did it! We did it!
The next morning, the group convenes and discusses their potential options, the first being running away to start a life somewhere else, while still on the run from Finn and the police, who believe Dan and Jessica had robbed a bank, and their second being turning themselves in and filing a report on Finn, who would potentially out Dan as Sean McCaffrey, and exposes all of his criminal past, which will send Dan to jail forever. The family decides to avoid both options, and as they try to find a viable third one, Omar suggests talking to his father, but the family turns him down before even hearing his idea. Later, Dan decides that the only way he can beat Finn is by first taking down the encrypted server, which requires him to enter the highly guarded mansion. He calls a family meeting in which everyone participates to come up with a good plan, and it's decided that the best possible route into the mansion is through the roof. Kyle then hands Dan a flash drive that has the ability to wipe out the server and erase files like evidence against Sean McCaffrey once and for all. Then, Dan distributes the mission equipment he took from Svetlana's house and begins to form a plan on how to breach the mansion. He then stresses to Jessica to abort everything, take the kids, and disappear if their mission fails, and calls for a family huddle, in which he finally accepts Omar's participation. Then, Dan and Omar head to the roof of the mansion and climb the walls like professionals, while the rest stay back in the car and provide tech support. The duo run around the roof smoothly and disable the security cameras. Then, Dan uses Omar as a distraction, sneaks up on one of the assassin guards, and realizes that it's one of his old acquaintances. Dan resists the man's attempt to bait him into a fight, disarms him, and orders him to tie himself with a ziplock. However, moments later, the guard uses this opportunity to pull a hidden gun on Dan and hold him at gunpoint. Dan handles this with his usual level of professionalism, and to his family's relief, manages to knock out the guard.
I'm here.
Then, using the advanced gadgets, Kyle manages to use the knocked out guard's voice to answer Finn, who demands to get a security report on the surrounding. Then, as per Dan's orders, Omar disables the last camera and heads down to the ground, where his friends organize a protest against oil companies and create a distraction. As soon as she sees this, Nina, who's a passionate member of Greenpeace, joins the protesters and leads them to the mansion's door while announcing that its owner is a big oil company executive abusing the environment. However, just as she leaves the protest, police officers catch Nina and start asking her questions about her involvement in the commotion. Seeing this from afar, Omar creates another distraction and gets arrested, which gives Nina an opportunity to escape. While Finn is distracted by the protesters as planned, Dan discreetly opens one of the ceiling glasses and enters the attic, which used to be his room growing up. Inside, he's surprised to see that his father had kept it as is and slowly goes around the room feeling nostalgic. However, moments later, Finn gets suspicious of the protest, decides to inspect the mansion, and catches Dan in the attic. To the utter horror of the Morgans, who hear everything through their earpieces, Finn proceeds to shoot Dan until he's stopped by Vikram, who informs his new master that they have rooms designed to take care of such situations and advises him to go there and handle Dan, who strategically leaves behind Kyle's flash as he follows Finn to the underground den. A few minutes later, to make matters worse, Finn discovers Dan's communication pieces and brutally tells the family that they will never see Dan again. As the terrified family tries to decide what to do, Kyle notices that his father had left the flash drive behind and shares that despite things looking grim, they can still help Dan by finding it and using it on the server. Despite Dan's order to abandon him and everything else at the sign of trouble, Jessica decides to help her husband and heads to the mansion, after warning the kids to go to the US Embassy if things get worse. Then, Jessica proves her athleticism as she jumps across the roofs of buildings to get to the mansions. There, she enters Dan's old bedroom, and as she lovingly looks around her husband's childhood memoirs, she finds the flash drive. With Nina's encouragement, Jessica takes it to the office.
Yes. Mommy flew.
In the underground den, Vikram directs Finn to place Dan over the drain and shoot him cleanly. But as Dan stands over the drain and Finn proceeds to shoot his brother, Vikram pulls the plug and drops Dan into the manhole of the drain, saving his life. Annoyed by this betrayal, Finn confronts Vikram, who firmly stands his ground.
Find him.
Upstairs, Jessica finally makes it to the office and plugs the flash drive, which grants Kyle access to the system. Kyle then activates the CCTV and, together with Nina, guides Jessica through the house and away from one of the assassins inspecting the house. Moments later, Jessica is forced to hide in the closet when the assassin makes it to the office and waits inside until she leaves. However, feeling cornered, Jessica is forced to jump out and take the assassin by surprise, which leads to a full-blown fight. In the underground tunnel, Dan takes the hitmen out one by one. Dan uses his knowledge of the tunnel to take sufficient cover and shield himself from the assassins. In the office, as the kids watch in terror, Jessica fights intensely with the assassin and finally manages to knock her out.
No, it's the guy from last night.
Mommy, we've got company.
Outside, Nina notices Finn's men approaching their car and urges Kyle to finish erasing the files from the server so that they can escape, while Jessica rushes out of the mansion to help her kids. In the mansion, Finn is terribly frustrated to learn that the server has been hacked, all $500 million drained, and the files deleted, and he promises to kill Dan and his kids as revenge. Outside, Jessica takes the kids to a carousel in the city, and after helping them escape from an assassin chasing them, she turns herself and the kids over to the police by revealing their identities and asking for help. Elsewhere, Dan and Finn's intense fight continues until Dan finally manages to overpower, tie up, and suspend Finn from a ceiling. Then, as Dan steps out of the building, he's arrested, but is happy to see all of his family despite their being in handcuffs. Then, as the Morgans discuss their fate, they realize that no matter where they are, the most important thing is that they are together. Then, moments later, Omar arrives with his father, who happens to be Secretary General of Interpol and their ticket out of their predicament. Then, Jessica summons her courage and shares about Ohio to Dan, who is happy and supportive. 11 months later in Columbus, Ohio, Jessica, Dan, and Max have settled into their new home and make preparations to host Nina and Kyle, who is now in college, for the holidays. Jessica thrives at work and is really happy with her new life, and Dan keeps a regular contact with Omar over video call, in which they update each other and share how much they appreciate one another. And hence, Dan is happy to receive Omar's latest update that he will visit them for Christmas. A month later, Dan goes to prison to visit Finn and gives him a matching jacket as a Christmas gift, knowing how much it would mean to him and give him a sense of belonging. Then the duo plays cards and renews their relationship.